Greetings and welcome back to today's Bible study, Back to the Island of Patmos, a study of Revelation. Today we'll be discussing Part 4, the beginning of sorrows. All Bible verses are taken from the New King James Version, unless otherwise indicated. As you may recall from Part 1, Jesus told his disciples that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. After that, the disciples asked Jesus when that would take place, and what would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 to 3. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 to 8. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." So the beginning of sorrows consists of wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. Also in Part 1, we discussed the first four seals, also known as the four horsemen. The first seal was the conqueror, or the rumor of war. The second seal was the sword, indicative of war. The third seal was famine, and the fourth seal was death by war, famine, plague, and wild beasts. Together, these create the ripple effect of war. Now let's compare the four horsemen with the beginning of sorrows. As you can see, the beginning of sorrows has the same elements as the four horsemen, with the additional earthquake. So to wrap up the beginning of sorrows, we are looking for an earthquake that takes place shortly after the first four seals. The first earthquake mentioned in the book of Revelation takes place in the sixth seal, Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 to 14. "I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of its place." So when the sixth seal is opened, there is a great earthquake. As a result of this earthquake, every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Compare this to the earthquake in the seventh bowl, Revelation chapter 16, verses 17 to 20. "Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, 'It is done.' And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as has not occurred since men were on the earth. Now the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found." In the sixth seal, every island and mountain are moved out of their place. This was called a great earthquake. Then in the seventh bowl, the islands and mountains are gone. This earthquake is described as the greatest earthquake that has ever occurred since men were on the earth. Could there be two great earthquakes that affect every island and mountain, the first that moves every island and mountain, and the second that levels them? Perhaps, but these two earthquakes describe successive quakes in close proximity. Let's take a look at the timeline of Revelation that would reflect the sixth seal and the seventh bowl in close proximity. Here's how the timeline works. Once the seals begin, they continue in order. Seal 1 through Seal 7. The trumpets start during the time of the seals, and once they begin, they continue in order. Trumpets 1 through 7. Near the end of the trumpets, the bowls start, and once they begin, they continue in order. Bowls 1 through 7. The seals, trumpets, and bowls overlap but all end at the same time. After this, Jesus returns and the wrath of God begins. So this would place the sixth seal, along with the seventh bowl, near the end of this timeline, right before Jesus returns and the wrath begins. These earthquakes do not take place in the beginning of sorrows. These take place near the end. The next earthquake mentioned in Revelation takes place before the first trumpet, Revelation chapter 8, verses 5 and 6. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Along with this earthquake, there is fire, noises, thunderings, and lightnings. Since this occurs immediately before the 7 trumpets, let's see if the first trumpet relates to any of these phenomena. Revelation chapter 8, verses 6 and 7. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The only element that the first trumpet shares with the earthquake before it is fire. With this fire is hail. Hail and fire are mentioned together another time in the Bible. This was during the time of Moses. Exodus chapter 9, verses 22 to 24. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, on man, on beast, and on every herb of the field, throughout the land of Egypt." And Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder, and hail and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail, and fire mingled with the hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt, since it became a nation. This is the 7th of the 10 plagues that God instructed Moses to inflict upon Egypt, because the Egyptians would not let the Israelites go to worship their God. This is the biblical explanation for the 7th plague. The 7th plague was the plague of hail, but the Bible describes hail in a very unique manner. The hail was together with fire, the idea being that the fire and the ice commingled together. They coexisted together. The Bible then describes God as making a miracle within a miracle, taking opposites in nature and having them exist together. Here is a possible scientific explanation for the hail and fire in the 7th plague. Egypt was struck by a strange hail made up of ice and fire mingled together, called accretionary lapilli, volcanic hail that could have come from the earthquake-induced Santorini volcano. Here is a picture of accretionary lapilli. Accretionary lapilli is a pyroclastic rock which is often formed when material produced by a volcanic activity is ejected into the air. Material between 2 to 64 millimeters is lapilli. Anything less is referred to as ash, and anything greater is referred to as volcanic bombs or blocks. The lapilli exhibit an accretionary feature, which is sometimes known as bird's eyes. They appear as numerous elongated glassy dots on the surface of the material. They're formed when volcanic particles in an ash cloud mix with moisture in the air and form a sort of hailstone. So could hail and fire be describing accretionary lapilli from a volcanic eruption during the time of Moses? And if so, could this be a description of the first trumpet as well? But what about the earthquake before the trumpets? Is there a correlation between the earthquake and the volcanic activity? Both volcanoes and earthquakes occur due to movement of the Earth's tectonic plates. They're both caused by the heat and energy released from the Earth's core. Earthquakes can trigger volcanic eruptions through severe movement of tectonic plates. Similarly, volcanoes can trigger earthquakes through the movement of magma within a volcano. Now let's discuss the elements of a volcanic eruption. Here are some pictures of volcanic lava fountains. Lava fountains are jets of fluid lava sprayed into the atmosphere during a volcanic eruption. The fountain gains its momentum by the rapid formation and expansion of gas bubbles in the molten rock. Lava fountains typically range from 30 to 300 feet in height, but occasionally can reach more than 1,600 feet. The lava fountain of Mount Vesuvius in 1779 reached an estimated height of 9,800 feet, or 1.8 miles. Here's a picture of a volcanic plume and the resultant ashfall. Volcanic plumes are mixtures of volcanic particles, gases, and entrained air that are produced by explosive eruptions. Material can be injected to high levels in the atmosphere and dispersed on a global scale as volcanic ashfall. Pumice is a pyroclastic igneous rock that is almost completely liquid at the moment of eruption and then is rapidly cooled. Pumice is formed when the lava comes into contact with water. This occurs most often with volcanoes near or under water. When the hot magma comes into contact with the water, rapid cooling and rapid depressurization creates bubbles. The rock changes almost immediately to a solid after coming into contact with the water, and the bubbles are trapped inside. Because pumice is igneous, it can at times appear glass-like. Pumice is found most abundantly in countries that ring the Mediterranean, particularly Italy, Turkey, Greece, and Spain. Here is a picture of volcanic lightning. Volcanic lightning is an electrical discharge caused by a volcanic eruption. Volcanic lightning generally occurs during the early stages of the eruption. Lightning that occurs near the ground is caused by individual ash particles which collide. This builds up enough static electricity to generate a lightning bolt. Volcanic lightning high up in the sky has a more surprising cause, which is ice. As the plume of ash and water vapor rises from the volcano, ice begins to form in its highest layers. The colliding ice crystals build up enough of an electric charge to trigger a lightning strike. Next comes thunder. Thunder occurs after the heat from a lightning bolt rapidly warms up some of the surrounding air particles while pushing others away. Following the strike, the air cools down and contracts at a high speed. This activity emits a cracking noise, which can be 10 times louder than the sound of a pneumatic jackhammer. And yet, in a volcanic eruption, it's easy for the boom of thunder to get drowned out by the long-range roars and cracks of the eruption, which are even more deafening. Experimental studies and investigation of volcanic deposits have shown that volcanic lightning creates a byproduct known as lightning-induced volcanic spherules, or volcanic glass. The temperature of a bolt of lightning can reach 30,000 degrees Celsius, or 54,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When this bolt contacts ash particles within the plume, it can do one of two things: either completely vaporize the ash particles, or cause them to melt and then quickly solidify as they cool, forming orb shapes. Now let's go back to the prelude to the trumpets, Revelation chapter 8, verses 5 and 6. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The prelude to the trumpets mentions an earthquake. A volcanic eruption is not specifically mentioned, but the characteristics of a volcanic eruption are, which would include fire, noises, thunder, and lightning within the plume of the volcanic eruption. Just for reference, The word volcano is not used in the Bible, so we need to base this conclusion on the characteristics given. The prelude to the trumpets would indicate that the earthquake and the volcanic eruption occur simultaneously or in close proximity to each other. Now on to the first trumpet, Revelation chapter 8, verse 7. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. This is the fire and hail that is also mentioned in the seventh plague during the time of Moses. This could be referring to the resultant ashfall dropping from the plume of an eruption, possibly as accretionary lapilli. Volcanic glass could also take on the appearance of hail. Now let's look at the second trumpet, Revelation chapter 8, verses 8 and 9. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and the third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The second trumpet describes something like a mountain burning with fire. Since the Bible doesn't use the word volcano, John gave the best description he could, being something like a mountain. In the dictionary, a volcano is described as a mountain or hill, typically conical, having a crater or vent through which lava, rock fragments, hot vapor, and gas are being or have been erupted from the earth's crust. Again, something like a mountain. Also note that the Bible doesn't say that the angel threw the mountain burning with fire into the sea. This picture shows a volcanic lava fountain along with a volcanic lava flow. Volcanic lava flows are streams of molten rock which pour down the sides of the volcano. Everything in the path of an advancing lava flow will be knocked over, surrounded, buried, or ignited by the extremely hot temperature of the lava. If the lava enters a body of water, the water may boil violently and cause an explosive shower of molten spatter over a wide area. Perhaps what John saw was a volcanic lava flow pouring down the side of a volcano and landing in the sea. This is a picture of a pyroclastic flow or surge. A pyroclastic flow is a dense, fast-moving flow of solidified lava pieces, volcanic ash, and hot gases. It commonly occurs when the plume of lava, ash, and gases expelled from the volcanic eruption loses the upward momentum and falls back to the ground. Pyroclastic flows tend to follow topography along predictable paths. These flows are extremely hot, burning anything in its path, and leaving behind a deep layer of solidified lava and thick ash. Pyroclastic surges are less dense, and so can move more quickly and can surmount topography such as hills and ridges. Therefore, their effects are more widespread and less predictable. Pyroclastic flows and surges can move as fast as 420 miles per hour, but the average speed is 60 miles per hour. Could this have been the images that John was seeing when he described something like a mountain burning with fire being thrown into the sea? And if so, when did this volcanic eruption take place? As you recall from part 1, John was told to write Revelation chapter 1, verse 19, "Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this." We had determined that the 4 horsemen occurred during the siege of Jerusalem in 66 to 70 A.D. Since John had his vision of Revelation in 95 A.D., the siege of Jerusalem would have been something that he had already seen or encountered prior to 95 A.D. And since the beginning of sorrows seems to include the 4 horsemen as well as an earthquake, it would seem reasonable that the earthquake would also be something that John had already seen. So we are looking for an earthquake and volcano that took place between 70 to 95 A.D. This brings us to Pompeii. The town of Pompeii, located about 5 miles from Mount Vesuvius, was a flourishing resort for Rome's most distinguished citizens. Elegant houses and elaborate villas lined the paved streets. Tourists, townspeople, and slaves bustled in and out of small factories and artisans' shops, taverns, cafes, brothels, and bathhouses. People gathered in the 20,000-seat arena and lounged in the open-air squares and marketplaces. On the eve of that fateful eruption in 79 A.D., scholars estimate that there were about 12,000 people living in Pompeii and almost as many in the surrounding region. The first trumpet, fire and hail. In 79 A.D., Mount Vesuvius erupted. The blast sent a plume of ashes, pumice, and other rocks, and scorching hot volcanic gases so high into the sky that people could see it for hundreds of miles around. The writer Pliny the Younger, who watched the eruption from across the bay, compared this cloud of unusual size and appearance to a pine tree that rose high to a great height on a sort of trunk and then split off into branches. Today, geologists refer to this type of volcanic eruption as a Plinian eruption. The earliest recorded observations of volcanic lightning are from Pliny the Younger, describing this eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 A.D. He stated, "There was a most intense darkness, rendered more appalling by the fitful gleam of torches at intervals, obscured by the transient blaze of lightning." As the plume cooled, the tower of debris drifted to the ground. For 12 hours, fine-grained ash and lapilli, then coarse white pumice, and later a gray pumice, rained down on the city of Pompeii at a rate of 6 inches per hour. The response was that people tried to find shelter or attempted to evacuate the city. The second trumpet, the burning mountain. For those who stayed behind, however, conditions soon grew worse. As more and more ash fell, it clogged the air, making it difficult to breathe. Buildings collapsed. The next day, a pyroclastic surge, a 100-mile-per-hour surge of superheated poison gas and pulverized rock, poured down the side of the mountain and swallowed everything and everyone in its path. By the time the eruption sputtered to an end, Pompeii was buried under millions of tons of volcanic ash. Most people died instantly by either inhaling or being buried under the pile of heated gas as high as 17 feet across the city in some places. About 2,000 Pompeians were dead, but the eruption killed as many as 16,000 people overall. Some people drifted back to town in search of lost relatives or belongings, but there was not much left to find. Pompeii, along with the neighboring town of Herculaneum and a number of villas in the area, were abandoned for centuries. Pompeii remained mostly untouched until 1748, when a group of explorers looking for ancient artifacts arrived in Campania and began to dig. They found that the ashes had acted as a marvelous preservative. Underneath all that dust, Pompeii was almost exactly as it had been before the eruption. Its buildings were intact. Skeletons were frozen right where they'd fallen. Everyday objects and household goods littered the streets. Later, archaeologists even uncovered jars of preserved fruit and loaves of bread. During the excavations in Pompeii, the remains of over 1,000 victims of the 79 AD eruption have been found. During the first phase of the eruption, those who hadn't left the city in time were trapped in their homes or shelters, buried by a shower of pumice stones and lapilli, or killed by the roofs and walls collapsing under the weight of falling volcanic debris. Of these victims, only the bones have been found. Afterwards, a high-temperature pyroclastic flow hit the city at high speed and filled all the spots not yet engulfed by other volcanic materials, so that anybody still in the city died at once of thermal shock. The body of these victims remained in the same position as when the pyroclastic flow hit them. Being covered by calcified layers of ash, the form of their bodies was preserved, leaving cavities after the biological material decomposed. Excavators filled the cavities with plaster, and the plaster casts now make gruesome exhibits of the dying people trying to protect themselves from the oncoming flows. But what about the third part? Revelation chapter 8, verses 7 to 9. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and the third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Many believe that 1/3 is referring to a third of the entire world, but it doesn't actually say that. It just says 1/3. Also note that the hail and fire were thrown to the earth, but it doesn't say the entire earth. And a single mountain is thrown into the sea, not all of the mountains. The 1/3 is referring only to the area where the disaster is taking place, not the entire world. 1/3 of the trees would be referring to 1/3 of the trees in that area of devastation, not 1/3 of the trees in the entire world. Here are a couple of maps of Mount Vesuvius. As you can see, Mount Vesuvius is in Italy. Pompeii is to the southeast of Mount Vesuvius. Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius are just off of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean Sea. Here is a map of the Mediterranean Sea. To the west of Italy is the Tyrrhenian Sea. Mount Vesuvius would have spilled lava and ash into the Tyrrhenian Sea, which then could have moved south into the Mediterranean Sea. So the sea referred to in the second trumpet could be the Tyrrhenian and or the Mediterranean Sea. 1/3 of the creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. The Roman Empire relied on the Mediterranean Sea for fishing and commerce, so this would have destroyed 1/3 of their food supply. Here was a comment from Pliny the Younger. Then we beheld the sea sucked back, and as it were repulsed by the convulsive motion of the earth. It is certain at least the shore was considerably enlarged, and now held many sea animals captive on the dry sand. The people of Pompeii were quite unprepared for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, getting on with their busy lives, in total ignorance of what was to come. The signs of impending disaster, however, were there. Why did no one pick up on them? Ancient Pompeii was located on a volcanic plain in southern Italy called Campania, while Mount Vesuvius sits on two fissures in the earth's crust, dominating this plain. When Pliny described the earth tremors in Campania in a casual manner, saying they are a frequent or a common occurrence, it makes evident that people were neither particularly shocked nor frightened at the time before the eruption, that they were clearly unaware of the link between seismic activity and volcanic activity. In our scientifically advanced world today, we can understand that Mount Vesuvius's long period of inactivity before the eruption was a clear link to the catastrophic magnitude this eruption would eventually have. The earth tremors that Pliny describes in his letter as growing much stronger were a sign of the mounting seismic activity in Mount Vesuvius, thus a looming disaster. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius was a recent event for John and for the first readers of Revelation. Even though John would have lived in Ephesus during the time of the eruption, and even though Ephesus was more than 1,000 miles from Pompeii, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius would have been a well-known event. Some Jews believed that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was a judgment of God on the Romans for destroying Jerusalem in 70 A.D. What do you think? Did God place judgment on the Romans 9 years after the siege of Jerusalem by causing the earth to quake and Mount Vesuvius to erupt? Were the first and second trumpets, along with the prelude to the trumpets, given to John the Apostle on the island of Patmos, a vision of Pompeii during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius? Thank you for attending Part 4, The Beginning of Sorrows. Stay tuned for Part 5, The Darkness, in this series, Back to the Island of Patmos. God bless.